Wow, we just finished hosting our Lorehaven booth at the Teach Them Diligently Homeschool Conference in Round Rock, Texas. And it was amazing. We had James R. Hannibal, author of Wolf Soldier and the showrunner of the Light Raiders game franchise. We had Jamie Foley, who writes books for Fayette Press, as well as doing marketing for Enclave Publishing. And we had myself representing Lorehaven and Zach Russell stopping by with multiple interviews with other homeschooling publishers and authors and other vendors at the Teach Them Diligently conference. And you will get to hear each of those conversations on this episode of Fantastical Truth. It's Fantastical Truth, once again, the podcast from Lorehaven.com, where we explore fantastical stories for God's glory and apply their meanings joyfully to the real world Jesus calls us to serve. I'm E. Stephen Burnett, Lorehaven's publisher. I also co-authored the nonfiction book about fiction called The Pop Culture Parent. And fun fact, I was homeschooled all of my life through age 18. The first time I went into an arguable public school classroom was community college.
And I'm Zackary Russell, and I guess you could say we are a hybrid homeschool family. We did homeschool for a number of years with our older kids. We put all of our kids in a charter school now, and but it's a half day, so we still get them in the mornings to do a lot of schooling. But this is episode 106. What if homeschool families can help Christian fantasy grow for generations? So this is going to be a fun conversation about what we experienced at the Teach Them Diligently conference and a lot of interviews that I conducted on site.
I will toss out a quick concession here and say that homeschooling is not God's choice for every Christian family. It's not something that those serious Christians do and everyone else is a compromiser who makes use of public schools, Christian schools, independent schools, something like that. But I have heard, Zach, increasingly more people whom I never thought would hear say this, secularists, humanist, more libertarian type folks, especially who are getting mad about public schools and some of the teachings therein. They are saying, homeschool your kids, homeschool your kids. And I'm feeling kind of happy about my parents who made this rather crazy decision back in the 1980s to do just that, long before it got as seemingly bad as it seems to be now in many areas of our culture.
Yeah, just a quick overview of some of the people I talked to yesterday. It was mostly Christian authors and book distributors and booksellers, and some of them had books that are more geared, like that are directly about the Christian faith, some that are more subtle, but also some that are geared towards a kind of a wider slice of society that, shares a lot of the same conservative traditional values, but maybe doesn't want, so content that's so heavy on religion, but that Christians would still really enjoy because it really is, it is developed from a Christian worldview. And that really gave me insight, Stephen, on the fact of what you just said, is that the homeschool movement is really expanding beyond just Christian families. It's going to very different families nowadays. And I read a statistic recently, there are 5 million homeschool kids now in the US, and that has grown like astronomically from when we were kids. So it's obviously taken off and for practical reasons because of COVID, but I think COVID also let a lot of families look in on their local school, and they said, well, I'm not against schooling, but I don't know about this school, or I don't know about this teacher, and or you know what, maybe I need to give more attention to my kids. And for a variety of reasons, a lot of people switched over. And so I love that there's this whole conference for parents that want to take that step or that are already in that world and they want to get some resources. And one last thing, Stephen, that was really funny to observe. Okay, so we're a family with 4 kids, and I expected that to kind of be the norm there. And I met so many families that were like, oh yeah, we got 5, 6, 9 kids. And I'm like, this is great. I mean, like, I love environments with big families, because then, for our kids, we're like, hey, we're actually, you might think we're in a big family, but you go to a homeschool convention and we're not. We're a small family. And so that's great.
I love it when people who are gifted by God with the resources and time and other gifts are able to have that many children. Some people do that for particular religious reasons, and they call that militant fecundity. But I think even then, God can use those family choices to glorify himself. And often it does turn out pretty well. You get kind of these homeschool family dynasties and kind of ministries of their own. I would think that Teach Them Diligently may count as one of those. This is not, by the way, the first such conference that I've attended. I think the first Teach Them Diligently conference I went to was actually in 2019. So before all of the pandemic lockdown stuff, I went and joined the Realmmakers Bookstore. I don't think it was Teach Them Diligently. It was another homeschool conference in Fort Worth in 2019. And then I realized, wow, this is amazing. We met so many families, so many people who are already interested in these kinds of books. Like, people's eyes go wide when we step in front of the booth and say, "Hi, we're Realmmakers Bookstore. What do your kids read? We have all Christian authors, fantasy, science fiction, and beyond." And we've had a previous podcast episode about that, Zach, after we went to the Florida conference in May of 2021. Still hoping to go back this year, by the way. But anyway, after that first event, I ended up setting up my own Lorehaven booth. I'm pretty sure it was a Teach Them Diligently conference, about a couple of hours from here, where we live in Central Texas. They were in Waco at the time. And once they started building this Kalahari resort in Round Rock, I remember looking at this huge complex going up and thinking, wow, that looks like that could be a good venue for a homeschool conference.
Oh man,
someday.
that place was gigantic.
Oh, it is indeed a gargantuan facility, and it's got, I think, the largest indoor water park or something on one end of the building, and then this enormous hotel in the other end.
Yeah, I grew up as a kid here in Central Texas, going to New Braunfels to Schlitterbahn, and so that was the destination of choice for all middle school and high school kids. That during hot Texas summers, it just blew my mind to go to a place with a water park where you're indoors and you get to walk through these air conditioned hallways and the kind of the elevator music or whatever. And yet there I was getting pizza and people come in, I'm just in normal clothes and people come in their swimsuits and barefoot or flip flops or whatever. And I was just like, this is pretty cool. Like, this is blowing my mind. But if you are a homeschool parent, homeschool family, welcome to the podcast. We hope you pull up a seat and enjoy these conversations we're going to have. Stephen, a big theme of my interviews yesterday was I asked these different authors or booksellers, why use stories? Like, especially when many of these authors and booksellers were developing nonfiction lesson curriculum that went along with their novels, like whether their novels were about dragons or time travel or knights in armor or science fiction or kind of urban fantasy, epic fantasy. In every case, I'm like, why develop stories? Like, why use that when you've already got the lesson plans? And so that was kind of the overarching theme of like, why use stories in discipling your kids and teaching your kids. I think if you're a parent, you're really going to enjoy these conversations. And maybe you're not a big fantasy reader, but your kids might be, or maybe they already were, and you're just looking for some new stories. So I think this is going to be a really fun conversation.
Well, speaking of new stories, this is one of those rare examples of a Fantastical Truth episode where most of the content is going to be completely new to me. Folks, Zach did all of the legwork on this. He arrived with all of his equipment and set up at the Lorehaven side of the booth and was doing these conversations while I'm at the other side of the booth and helping out with some of our guest authors, James Hannibal, Jamie Foley, and their families who were there. We talked to so many people who are not passing by the booth and giving what you might expect if you're less familiar with homeschooling or if your information is out of date. You may expect people to give the fantasy booth, the weird one with the teenage boy with a live dragon on his shoulder. Yes, we had one of those. You might expect them to give it a wide berth, maybe put up the sign of the cross with their fingers, to ward off the Dracula or something. That's nonsense. That's no longer the case. Certainly not at this conference, and certainly not at many of the other conferences that I've attended. I'm sure some of those beliefs are still out there, and we want to respect those. But here, people are looking for Christian-made fantasy. We can tell them, hey, these books are not, textbooks. They are not preaching at you, but they do have a Christian worldview at their foundation. They're all by Christian authors. And of course, two of those authors were here with us at the time, nonfiction Z. Stephen Burnett, as well as fantasy authors James R. Hannibal and Jamie Foley. James was there with his Light Raiders game. He has several now affiliate games for which they've done fundraising, and he was able to show off the dice and the game board and explain how it works with the scripture memory and all of that. We actually stayed up late on Friday night, late by conference hours anyway, for homeschool conference hours. It felt late at the time. We actually managed to get a room and do kind of a beta test of the Light Raiders game.
Oh, cool. What was that like?
It was great. It's the new version of Dragon Raid. So it's not like he got out, the 1984, red box of the Dragon Raid game that we've talked about elsewhere on the podcast. He was getting out the new version. So these are kind of homemade items, 3D printed tokens, but all of the script for the game has been done. You sit around the table, he kind of had little sheets with the stats pre-filled in just to give a quick start to everybody who's there, especially if you're new to tabletop stuff, like I am, by the way. I'm still pretty new to that, but it was really fun. And you can see how the scripture memory test is integrated into the game. It's not a Dungeons and Dragons ripoff. In fact, he very happily tells the account of Gary Gygax, the Dungeons and Dragons guy, approaching the original Dragon Raid creator Dick Wolf at a conference, thanking him for not ripping off D&D back in the day.
Well, that's right. That's been my observation. It's not a Christian Dungeons and Dragons.
No,
it's
if you like D&D,
role-playing
try
version.
me. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a role-playing version of Awanas.
Yes, exactly. And by the way, James likes that line, and he repeated that quite a few times to folks who are very interested in this. They want to enjoy God's gift of imagination while also exploring his word and applying these verses in context to these imagined scenarios as part of this fantasy adventure that everyone's playing out around the table. And I think that's a great way to enjoy fantasies, as I've said, as discipleship. I don't like fantasy that preaches at you, not because I don't like preaching, but because the job of preaching belongs to the preacher. That is Sunday morning, Wednesday night, Bible study stuff. That is how God communicates his word to our heads and hearts. But stories have a different goal. They function secondarily as a means of discipleship if they're well made and if they're created by a Christian who wants to glorify God actively through the excellence of the storytelling experience.
Well, since we were kind of two sides of the same coin here, I missed a lot of the conversations you had, Stephen, because I wasn't able to make it until that last day. So tell me about what were some of the highlights from your conversations at the booth, especially on Thursday and Friday before I was able to make it there. What were some memorable moments that you had talking with either James or Jamie or just parents that stopped by the booth?
Absolutely. Probably the best experience I had at first was simply doing my presentation, which is at noon on Thursday. We didn't even have the booth up yet because some of our folks weren't in town so far, and the exhibit hall had not yet opened. But I did a presentation called Why Do Your Kids Need Fantastical Stories for God's Glory? And we had a good, I'd say like a couple dozen people in there. So it's a good group that doesn't make me feel alone in the room, which can be awkward for public speaking, but not so large that it prevented interactivity. I could speak for about an hour going through the scripture about how fantasy is a unique way that we appreciate God, Jesus's heroism, and our mission in the world. And I kind of went through, and I'll admit, I was talking about this view of fantasy in contrast to the view that fantasy is a tool to hammer bad agendas into your kids' heads. And yes, we did drop the D word Disney quite a few times and talk about what all nonsense they're up to now. Apparently not just trying to promote neutral, wholesome entertainment for the kids that you can put it on the TV and then leave the room. Now you've actually got Disney creators caught in the act saying we want to make half of our characters basically agenda characters in order to reproduce our particular sex emphasizing cult. And this is something that could, I think, play a little too well with a Christian audience. But I didn't mind going there and saying, no, guys, I think they really are after the kids. We still need to love our enemies, but this means that we need to be better prepared to engage our world, to engage the reasons that God has given us the ability to make and share and enjoy these stories. And we just had a lot of really good conversations about that. Just a couple of Q&A about the purpose of fantasy. And a lot of people who I realize already know that their kids are enjoying these stories. One person told me that she came in thinking, well, maybe this is something I can consider for my kids. But then she realized her kids are already enjoying fantasy, whether it's Christian made or otherwise. Like, it's going to get in there one way or another. And I think that God gives us the gift of fantastic imagination, that it's something we're always going to make up. Like if we were locked inside a biosphere or something, it's just something humans are going to do. We're going to feel that impulse to create, to imagine, and we don't know why. And so I go to scripture and go, well, here's why. God has given us this gift to glorify him. We had people coming by the booth. I've sold a few copies of the Pop Culture Parents, my book with Ted Turneau and Jared Moore. And people just happened to see like, wow, like this really meets a need, going through the purpose of popular culture, including fantasy imagination, and trying to understand that biblically and helping to train our kids from a young age up through adulthood, and not just walling it all off as idolatry, but not just accepting it all as common grace either. James and them, they would have some amazing stories to tell. And when we talked to them about the many, many families to whom they spoke, and the many people who came up to Jamie and what we're buying her books or buying books from Enclave Publishing, all Christian made fantasy and sci-fi.
I'm so optimistic right now, Stephen, about the state of Christian fantasy and science fiction. I think there is going to be a massive, massive demand for it. Again, this is my hopeful, optimistic side, because of what the big D word you mentioned, Disney. Disney has become such a toxic brand recently. Not content to just kind of subtly weave in their values, but just overtly becoming political actors. There are so many people that might not even totally disagree with Disney, but they get so turned off when corporations do this, when they take this hard stance and just draw a line in the sand and say, on this side are our enemies, on this side are our allies, and we're going to fight to the death over whatever this issue is. That turns a lot of people off. Like, a lot of people just want to go enjoy the products or services of a company and not think about what it is that they want to get so involved with politically. I mean, politics is it's messy, and it a lot of people just don't want anything to do with it, whatever their values are. But at the same time, Disney has really instilled this hunger and this desire for fairy tales, fantastical stories, science fiction. And so where are we going to go now? Where are we parents going to go that are canceling Disney? I haven't canceled it yet, but there's a lot of people that have canceled it or didn't have it in the first place or wish they could cancel it again. And so where are they going to go now for stories, especially with as hard as it is to get visual stories made on the big screen or the streaming screen? We're going to go to books. We're going to go to new books or old books. Christian authors, this is just such a golden age. I think it's going to be the second golden age of and we'll talk about the first golden age later with one of my guests. That's what I hope to see happen. We'll see what shakes out. What were some of the memorable moments with Jamie from Enclave, and obviously representing her own books, or James? You mentioned there was a lot of conversations they were having with people. I got to overhear James explaining Light Raiders to someone. But in any moments from your interactions with them that you can talk about?
I just love seeing the kids' faces when they see the dragon perched on top of the shoulder of James's son. And we're just going to say that, yes, that is a real dragon, or a paradragon, as he has it reckoned in his Light Raiders world. It turns its head, it looks at you, and it's just a sweet little furry dragon. And the children just go, whoa, and they aren't sure whether they're allowed to touch it. And of course, it's great to, I don't know if this is the official phrase, but it's great booth bait, for starting those conversations and then asking, like, hey, do you like dragons? Do you like fantasy? Well, here's Light Raiders. It's all about the scripture memory while you're playing through, these cards and these dice and all of that. And then you get generally older kids who come by, like some of whom already know Jamie because she actually lives around in this area. Or they're familiar with Lorehaven because they've been to previous homeschool conferences where we featured, or they're familiar with Realm Makers because usually when I'm going to a conference, it's with the Realm Makers bookstore. So a lot of them are coming back for seconds and thirds and fourths of several of the book series that they've gotten acquainted with. And you have these beautiful covers, a lot of them hardcover from Enclave Publishing, featured right out there in front, along with Jamie's own books, Emberhawk and Silverblood, and some of those, her Sentinel trilogy. I saw lots of people walking out with trilogies. Like James has multiple trilogies across several genres, including some middle grade fiction as well as YA, and then some grown up military thrillers. So people were getting all of those. But certainly at a homeschool conference, most folks are there looking for stuff for their kids. So they're walking out with several of Jamie's books. And of course, if you're an author there who's able to sign your book and talk about how much fun stories can be, especially when you're reading them, but also if you happen to enjoy writing them, that just helps the kids even more. And I can't even think of a particular scenario. That's just the sort of thing I've grown to expect at these kinds of events. By the way, these kind of events do take a toll. Afterwards, you have to kind of retreat to the Lorehaven recording studio and take some time to yourself. So that's what Zach and I are doing. And we're also taking some time for ourselves in this episode for our sponsor. The sponsor for this episode is once more the Lorehaven Guild. And I'm saying this because as of this episode's release date, we have just wrapped our March book quest for The Seventh Son by Lonnie Forbes. Actually, because of this event, true confession here, ended up going overtime by a few days for that book. Just posted the last questions on Saturday. But our next book quest already underway is for the Green Ember, S.D. Smith's fantasy series with talking rabbits joining a resistance to fight for the restoration of the forest. We had SD Smith on at Fantastical Truth back in February, and we just decided, it's a great time with spring in the air, and a lot of people are thinking about wabbits at this time of year because somehow that got associated with Resurrection Sunday. Our writer at Lorehaven, Elijah David, is leading this quest through SD Smith's The Green Ember at the Lorehaven Guild, which is a Discord community exclusive to those who subscribe to Lorehaven. So just go to lorehaven.com/subscribe. Input your name. It's free, of course. You will get whatever notifications you choose for all of our new Lorehaven content, as well as your super secret access code to join the Lorehaven Guild community, which already has several new members after we were talking about it at the conference, by the way, Zach. I'm there in real life and then seeing people enter the virtual space of the Lorehaven Guild. So we're glad to meet new friends and find this new digital way to engage these books. It doesn't require you to go to a specific place in real life once every week. It can just be always on in the background, probably one of the better uses of social media to join other Christians to discern and enjoy a Christian-made fantastical work together.
Yeah, this really is our community that we're trying to curate a very unique place where it's for book lovers. It's a place to discuss books, and we have a book every month, but also we're talking about all kinds of books that we love to read and that maybe have challenged us or that we just keep going back to over and over again, like comfort food, because it's just such a fun story. And I love it, Stephen. I love that I can always go there to jump in a conversation about a story, either a new story or an old story. I remember when I was really getting into Christian fantasy as a genre a few years back, and it was just so hard to find people that would talk about this. That first of all, they want to talk about books at all, especially if it was this month of another year because it's March Madness. And, that's a fandom I don't hate it, but I just have no clue about. I don't know anything about. And someone asked me the other day, well, how's your bracket doing? I'm like, I wouldn't know where to start with the bracket. I mean, I love to watch basketball with Paxton because he's big into basketball, but I don't know what any of it means. The only sport I follow is Aggie football, as I've said before. If your fandom is reading these kind of books, then I think it's going to be a place you'll enjoy.
Well, speaking of jumping into those conversations, I'm eager to hear your conversations myself, Zach. So let's jump into the TARDIS or whatever time transport method you prefer. Rewind to just a couple of days to teach them diligently was still in the present and enjoy those conversations that you had with several creators of those Christian-made resources for homeschool families.
Well, I am here with Jonathan Cox from Brave Books. Thanks so much for joining us, Jonathan. Tell us more about yourself and Brave Books.
Well, first, thank you for having me. This is awesome. So my name is Jonathan. I'm kind of all over the place when it comes to what I do at Brave Books, but we help to develop a book that will help parents to teach complex topics to their children. And so our first book is over gender identity. And we don't want to be intrusive because no one really wants to talk about these topics in today's society. Because why? Why would you want to do that? So we realized that if we don't, as parents, teach our children, culture's going to, and they're going to make the first move, and then that's going to be embedded in the kids' perception of what the gender movement is, and then that just messes up their logical paradigm, and we don't like that. So we have spent hours and hours of research, really months of research when it comes to understanding a topic, and then we try to make a fun, creative story for parents to be able to read to their kids so that kids can have a proper paradigm of how to deal with the idea of gender identity. And that's we do that for every topic that we'll dive into. CRT, we'll dive into cancel culture, the idea of truth and freedom and the Second Amendment. We'll go all over the place and look at what's big in culture and what's kind of being destroyed by modern pop culture today, and then how can we teach it biblically to children.
Now, the first book that came out was Elephants Are Not Birds. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, and it was Ashley St. Clair, I think, was the author of that.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I originally heard about that a while ago, and so tell me about, like, what's the basic story of that book?
So the basic story is there's an elephant named Kevin, and he really likes to sing. And then there's a vulture named Culture, and he comes and then tells elephants that really only birds sing, not elephants. And so then he starts to make Kevin believe that because he sings, that he's really a bird inside of an elephant's body.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can immediately see the connection. You know, I've heard it said, chauvinism said women should do the dishes, and feminism said men should do the dishes. But then gender identity says whoever does the dishes is a woman.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of the same thing. It's like,
Yes.
these very like stereotypical ways of looking at men and women are what define them.
Oh gosh.
And so that's great. So this is a story though that you're teaching these truths about where we find our actual identity.
Yes.
But
yes.
what these kind of messages we get from culture. So why did you guys decide to use a story to kind of convey these ideas?
Well, it seems that whenever you build a story, you're building a logical structure for children. And so they're going to view life through those lens. And so they're going to do that whether you're getting it from television, whether they're getting stories from you, from stories from the children's books they're reading at school, from their cartoons. It's all going to build a paradigm for how they view life. And what we saw was so powerful with stories and with illustrations is you can build really whatever paradigm you want to with your kids. And that's important for you as parents because that's your obligation and duty. You have to prepare them for society, prepare them for the real world. And it just seems like if you're not, culture's getting to them first, and it's so subjective, it's so wishy-washy that there's nothing solid to stand on. And it seems with story, it's the best way to do that, and kids receive it really well.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what I believe, that stories, especially these kind of fantastical stories with talking animals, they're so memorable, and that's how you remember important lessons and truths and stuff. So tell me about some of the other books you guys have, besides the identity issues. Tell me about some of the stories that portray these different ideas.
Yeah, so our next book would be, we've put out 10 books so far, and put out a new book every month. And so the book after the first one is about sanctity of life. The next one's about capitalism versus communism. The fourth one's about cancel culture. The fifth one's about critical race theory. The sixth one's about the Second Amendment. And that one's a really easy one to dive into, the Second Amendment. And so you have this town, and they have these gorillas and just different animals, yaks and bunnies and whatnot. And they have something called these coconut cannons. And so Bongo really likes his coconut cannons. And then one day a hyena comes in and then takes Bongo's food, which he's very much in love with. And then the hyena shoots Bongo on the head with a coconut cannon. And like, so Bongo is upset and startled. And then his friend is upset that the hyena came and shot him with the coconut cannon. And so then she said, okay, it's the coconut cannon's fault that this is happening. And so then Bongo's like, I don't think so. That's not what happened. If I would have used mine, I could have defended myself. And so then the town splits in two, and there's this bridge that goes over this river, and they decide to destroy the bridge. And so that if you want a coconut cannon, you'll live on this side. If you don't want a coconut cannon, you'll live on this side. And then immediately after that, you have a whole group of hyenas that hear that this group doesn't have any coconut cannons to defend themselves. And so then they come in, and then they use their coconut cannons to steal all the food from the other ones.
Oh no.
And so then the other half of the town decide that it's not right for them to let that happen. And so they come through and then start defeating the hyenas, just showing that having a weapon to defend yourself is vital, and that's why it was in the Constitution. That's why it was laid out. And it's just a simple story, but once you put it in those simple terms, it's easy for kids and even liberal adults to understand. So that's
Well, that's great. I mean, these concepts have been part of our country for hundreds of years, but it does seem in the last few years, few decades, they're all being upended. They're all being questioned and interrogated and whatever. And they're becoming problematic. That's the big word. You can meet those objections with logical arguments, and those are very needed. But stories are a great way to just show here's what it actually looks like. If you take this argument and put it in the sort of the talking animal kingdom with coconut cannons, man, now I really want a coconut cannon. I think we should. Someone should invent that. That sounds like really fun.
We're working on it, actually. Another thing with the age groups we're working with from 4 to 12 years old, we realized that if you try to tell a story to, 12-year-old, there's an exception there, even 10 to 12. Whenever you try to tell the story from a person's perspective, they're so egocentric that it's hard for them to understand what you're saying. But for some reason, and I don't know why, whenever you put it in the perspective of animals, they completely understand it, which is so strange, but we want to use it to our advantage to be able to teach complex topics, and it seems to work.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously Disney does that. They figured that out a long time ago, that you have these animals that, tell you timeless truths like follow your heart,
Oh, that works out really well.
Yeah.
Or my biggest issue, and my background being in psychology, hearing the phrase happily ever after, like as soon as I get married, as if as soon as you get married, all of your problems are gone, life is going to be easy. And then you just see this huge divorce rate. And these people that go into marriage that think that, oh, as soon as you get married, there's not going to have to be any work, there's not going to have to be any change. Disney has been one of the most harmful things, I think, to society. And I think that's powerful because they're so big now. And people don't realize, even though they make great quality content, the moral foundation is just lacking.
Yeah. Well, and it's further eroding, and it's very rapidly eroding. And so it's great to see companies like y'all putting out original things for young children. I think that's what's so unique about you guys is that, these are as low as age 4. These are really simple stories that kids can understand, and then it sort of sticks with them. It's like, yeah, maybe these, ideas I'm getting from Disney aren't the best ideas, and they start to kind of compare these stories together because that's how kids think on the level of stories.
Yeah.
My kids, I've got 4 kids, and they love Paw Patrol, and Paw Patrol is that's a pretty good story, but that's what sticks with them, and they go play Paw Patrol. They've got all the figurines, and they watch all the cartoons, and the cartoons tell them, oh, you got to go buy a new toy now, of course, and it's okay, that's fair, but so maybe coconut cannons and it could be something you guys could think of as like as a toy, maybe.
Yeah.
Because that's, but my point is that the kids not only love to hear stories and hear the same stories over and over again, they want to act out the stories.
Yes.
And it's through that acting, it's through that portrayal that really cements in their head how life works.
Yeah.
And so I love that you guys have really leaned into that. Well, tell our listeners, how can they find your books, and where can they find you guys?
Yeah, so you can find our books on bravebooks.com. We're not on Amazon due to, we'd get kicked off if we put a bunch of books on gender up there. But you can go to bravebooks.com, and the way it works is we're subscription-based, or you can buy single purchase, or you can buy an annual subscription, and all the details will be on the website. I highly encourage going and just looking at what topics do you think you need to teach your kids. And the real goal is to provide parents with the ability, with the tools necessary to be able to teach these complex topics. So we spend hours researching them and then providing the best equipment we can to you so that you can teach them, because parents just aren't equipped today and kids need it. If we don't get to them first, then culture will.
Jonathan, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Zach.
Well, I'm here now with Aaron Gruben, an author of fantasy, science fiction, time travel history. And he's going to talk to us about his books, and we're going to talk about chivalry. And I wish you could see Aaron, because he's got this awesome outfit, a knight's outfit, complete with a sword and a helmet. And so he looks like he has time traveled from the past to the present. I'm very jealous of this outfit. So, Aaron, why don't you tell us about yourself and what do you write?
Oh, thank you very much. It's good to meet you, Zach. So, I am Aaron Gruben. I'm actually a veterinarian in my not writing life. So I love history and science fiction and fantasy. So I kind of incorporate all of those into my writing. One of the things that gets me excited is the Commandments of Chivalry that we've forgotten a lot of by now. So there's a gentleman named Léon Gautier in the 1800s who codified chivalry into 10 commandments.
Oh, okay.
I try to take his Commandments of Chivalry and kind of incorporate those into my writing a lot of times.
That's great.
I've been writing a lot of time travel books. One thing that's a little bit different in my time travel books is the idea of temporal amnesia. So I'm kind of more of a medical background than engineering. So I started thinking about what time travel might do to your mind. So that if you end up in the past too long, you might start forgetting who you are, and your brain makes up a whole different background, and you can get lost in the past. So that might be time travelers lost in all kinds of centuries that we don't know about because they never came back and forgot who they are. Wow.
So it affects not just where you are, but how you think of yourself and where you think you belong, and then finally you become something else. That's really cool.
Exactly right. That's why we don't know about time travel right now. It's around, but there's the time travelers that have forgotten who they are. So.
That's great. I like that theory. So tell me about chivalry. So why make that a theme, and what do you mean by chivalry?
Oh, good question. So I guess the very simplest definition I can think of for chivalry is codified Christian servanthood. So the whole point of chivalry is to help you be a good, strong Christian servant. and the code of chivalry incorporated all kinds of things in the past, anything from defending the church to what we always think of as defending widows and orphans and things like that. That's an important part of chivalry also. The Crusades had a lot to do with chivalry. I ended up writing quite a bit about the Crusades in some of my writing too, which gets to the more controversial side of chivalry. It's fun to write about just because there's a lot of good things and bad things to write about, and distinguishing the historical aspects of chivalry from the ideals behind chivalry, which sometimes were different. So chivalry is a big code that developed over hundreds and hundreds of years, and it meant a whole lot more than we think of now. So it's exciting to kind of rethink of how it might be useful, especially the ideals behind it, to live today.
So tell me about this fantasy time travel book. You mentioned it to me off the air a little bit ago about Charles Dickens finding a hand grenade or something, right?
Oh, yeah. So that's the second time travel book in the series I've been writing, and it's called Fatal Fogs. And at the start of the book, it's starts with that. There's a hand grenade on an illustration in a textbook about Charles Dickens, and it's on his desk, and they have to figure out why that
an illustration
happened.
Okay, so not an actual grenade.
Well, it actually is a grenade.
Okay. I hope so. A holy hand grenade,
pretty much. Well, so I'm trying not to give away too much story, but yes. So the protagonist ends up sending the hand grenade to himself. There's a little bit of time looping going on in this story, one of the characters is an authoress back in Charles Dickens' time, and she wrote about this grenade on the desk, and it ends up in Cal's hands, and they're trying to figure out why in the world a hand grenade showed up on Charles Dickens' desk. They get embroiled in a mystery that involves Edwin Drood, the last novel that Dickens didn't finish. They start to conjecture about reasons he may not have finished it, and temporal amnesia becomes an important part of that story too. So.
That's a great aspect. You don't, like we were saying a minute ago, you don't usually see that in a time travel story. So who are these books for? Like what age group? What kind of person reads these books?
Oh, good question. A lot of high schoolers like these books, so I kind of had high schoolers to adults kind of in mind in these books. Some kids younger than high school have enjoyed them too. I've had a few 12-year-olds really like these books too.
So why come to a homeschool conference to talk about fantasy time travel books?
Well, that's a good question. So I was homeschooled. That's my background. Homeschool my kids, so it's kind of my own culture that I'm used to. But then a lot of the same general ideas that a lot of homeschoolers appreciate are in my stories as well. My characters, a lot of them were homeschooled, and so the protagonist is a former homeschooler. They went to vet school just like me. I figured you'd write about what you know.
There you go.
So kind of it's a market that my characters would fit into.
Well, that's cool. There's not a lot of stories that you see or watch or listen to that are about a homeschool educated child. It's usually like big high school, prom, football, lockers, all the kind of stereotypes of high school shows. So that's really cool that it's a homeschool character.
Yep. Yeah. So at the end of this month, I'll have another book out of the first homeschool superhero.
There we go.
And that one kind of fits into the Fatal Fogs book too. It's not sequential, but it's in the same world, and I intersperse a bunch of characters and make them trot across the same pages.
That's cool. So tell us about some of the conversations you've had with parents or teens here about your books.
Had lots of different conversations, a lot like this one. We're talking about aspects of time travel and just fun adventures. A lot of people are interested in chivalry. It's an exciting time to bring chivalry back into the world, I think. A lot
Absolutely.
of people want to rediscover that. So I've had a lot of conversations, especially with parents, about that. My chivalry books are more like school studies, so they're kind of less exciting for the kids that come to the booth. So I don't talk to them about that as much. I'm wearing armor, like you mentioned. I have a spear and a sword and a helmet. So been doing lots of show and tell too. All the kids like to try on the chainmail and get to see all this stuff.
Well, and then tell me about how your faith plays a part of your stories.
My faith is really integral in the stories, I suppose I'd say. just because it's what I believe. So rather than specifically trying to preach it in my stories, it's just part of who I am. So it tends to come out in the characters that are Christians anyway. Some of them aren't, and some of them are. So I try to incorporate my faith. Now, usually every single book I write, I have a moral of the story in mind as well, and some of those are based on matters of faith, and some of them aren't. So in Fatal Fogs, I was especially thinking about sovereignty and how God is sovereign over history and could be sovereign even over time travel.
That's fascinating. Well, Aaron, where can our listeners find you and your books?
They're all on Amazon. I also have my own website. My company is Post Tenebris Books, and we've got a website which is posttenebrisbooks.com. And I have a blog I do. You can find all my books on that too. It's nmgrubens.com. It stands for New Mexico Grubens, Gruben. Used to live in New Mexico until 2 years ago. So.
All right. Well, glad to have you here in the great state of Texas.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here. I've liked Texas.
Well, thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, thank you, Zach.
I am talking now with Catherine Gruben-Smith, and she is the sister of the author we just talked to, Aaron Gruben. And so Catherine, or Katie as she goes by, is a author of steampunk, dystopian, fairy tales, science fiction, fantasy, and spy thrillers. So all kinds of genres. This is going to be a lot of fun to talk about. So Katie, tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Hello. Thank you for letting me come and be here. I appreciate it. I am a mother of two. I love to sword fight with my brother when I have the chance, but we don't too often with our children. Yes, indeed. We love our board games. We, of course, love writing. It's an amazing blessing to be able to sit down and pound out ideas that will hopefully last throughout generations.
Yeah, there you go. Now, did you and Aaron write stories a lot growing up? Did you write things together?
We haven't yet. We keep talking about doing a crossover book, but I think we'll have to wait till some of the children grow up before we'll get to that.
Yes. It is a challenge with young children to get anything done outside the work hours and at home, especially creative work where you have to really get into the flow of things. So tell me first about this spy thriller. I understand this is it's more like a clean story. It's
yes.
And there's kind of a dearth of those when you get into spy. You think of James Bond, or you think of Spy versus Spy. You think of all kinds of vices that might happen and content warnings. So
it's true.
What's unique about your spy stories?
My spy stories are unique partially because I really enjoy reading spy stories, but like you say, it's hard to find good ones. So I enjoyed writing ones that are both clean and good stories. And they're also character-based a little bit, because that's one of the things I enjoy so much is creating characters and having them interact. So that's always an interesting thing. Also, it's fun with spy stories to be able to write a book where the heroes know what they're fighting for, because in a lot of spy stories, there's always a reason behind the plot line, but often the author or the movie writer, whoever it is, hasn't really thought it through very well, but they're always portraying something. So it's always fun to be able to write one where you know where you're coming from and are able to tell the reader.
There you go. Now, how does steampunk factor in? Tell me about that story. By the way, I wish this was a video podcast, because you would see Katie's awesome steampunk outfit here.
Well, thank you.
Complete with goggles and cool, I guess it's like a pin there at the top of this kind of overcoat that you're wearing.
Yes, the pendant is a raven, because this is a series set in a world that has collapsed. This civilization has collapsed about 200 years before, and so they reset up civilization on different books, and you have to have a book at the base of each kingdom to be able to survive, and the Bible is stolen, and so the two main characters end up having to try to restart their kingdom, and there's a mute musician who comes in to help them, and he is called the Raven, along with his chimera friend who helps him with all of his things. And in the course of that, you start realizing that he's much more than a musician, and that there's much interesting plot lines going on in the background that I can't talk about, because then you would know the plot.
Too many spoilers. Yeah.
Exactly, yes. So it's a bit steampunk and dystopian are two different genres that it would fall into. That one would be young adult. It's a little bit more intense than some of my other ones, so I would call that one young adult.
Yeah. So books actually kind of empower these kingdoms and give them certain abilities or certain
It's
technology or something?
It's the idea behind that is that if you don't have a book, then you're not allowed to exist in that world. So the other kingdoms will kind of gang up on you and knock you out. So, but it's each one is based on the ideas of the particular book. So I have the Humanist Manifestos, and I ended up with Plato in there. The one I'm working on right now has Beowulf. That's been fun.
Okay.
So yeah.
I really love stories, and especially books about books.
Yes,
I think it's
that's
such
what
a
this
fun,
is.
it's kind of Inception happening.
Exactly. It's a book talking about how wonderful books are.
There you go. And for all book readers and all book lovers, understand that. So,
Exactly. It has a lot of eucatastrophe, especially towards the end.
And now you've got an elementary age and middle grade series out, right?
Yes, I have fairy tales, like the old style fairy with the F-A-E, not the other one.
Okay.
And it's those were a lot of fun to write because that's another genre I've always enjoyed, and it's hard to find fun ones because they're usually on one side of being too weird or one side of being just a little too fluffy. So It was very entertaining to get to write some that are just fun. And those are my elementary age ones. And then I have a fantasy sci-fi series that depends on the reading level, honestly, of the person who picks it up. But the 5-book series that is written from different people's perspectives. So that was fun. It's it has first person discussions in it all the way through. That's how I tell the story, but it's different people that tell it.
Now, when I talked to your brother a minute ago, he mentioned chivalry. It was kind of his overarching theme, and he's got, I guess, some nonfiction books about chivalry, the 10 Commandments of Chivalry. What would you say are some of the overarching themes of your stories?
Overarching things of my stories would be Christianity in general, just because that is the real reality of the world, so that's what we all live in. So that is all of it. But for the main part, I think just main stories. I like telling stories, and it's very fun, and I like having a good plot line. And I also really enjoy playing with characters. All of mine, would say, are pretty character-based.
That's so true. You said a minute ago about there was an interview with Jordan Peterson I'm thinking of where he said Christianity is more than true. Or I think he said the Bible is not only true, but it's more than true because it is led to all kinds of truth.
Yes.
And it's like the foundation for truth itself. And
yes.
He's saying this as I don't think he's a believer. Maybe he's close. Maybe he's, I don't know. Everyone debates that. But I think this is exactly the right way to look at it. It's like how C.S. Lewis said, I don't believe in the sun because I see it, but because I see everything else.
That was exactly the quote I was thinking of.
Yeah,
yes.
Very cool. Well, that is really neat how you're portraying that. Now, why come to a homeschool conference and tell us about what that's been like for you?
Partially because we enjoy homeschool conferences and we love the people that attend homeschool conferences. That's we grew up in that kind of a culture, and it's a beautiful thing to see so many unique people coming together wanting to train their children in the way that they believe, no matter what way that is. And it's a beautiful thing to watch and get to take part in. So we love getting our books out to the people who might need them.
Yeah. Well, Katie, where can our listeners find you and your books?
I have a store that is postneighborsluxbooks.com, and then I also have a website under my name, and you can also find me on Amazon in both Kindle and regular book.
All right. Well, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
So I am talking now to Shannon Mockery. She is a children's middle grade and YA author and writes a lot of fantasy and kind of fairy tale type books, and also books about how to write books. So Shannon, tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Well, I'm a homeschool mom, and I've been homeschooling for about the past 10 years. I've lived in Texas for 24 years. I came from California. Yeah, I know, I'm one of those.
Well, you came a while ago, so that's okay. You didn't come just last year.
I've been here long enough. I like to say I got here as quick as I could and put down roots. All 3 of my babies were born here, and when I talk to other native Texans, I sound like a native Texan.
Yeah.
But, my California roots show up when I talk normally.
Yeah, well, I have a Texas accent that comes out once in a while, and certain words will definitely bring it out. Like yesterday, I changed my oil on my car. I can't say that any other way than that.
Well, it's funny because you're from the Austin area,
right,
and Austin is such a global community that very few people have a thick Texas accent that are from the general Austin area.
Yeah, they try to hide it. Well, something you told me earlier that was interesting before we recorded was that your books are geared towards parents of special needs. So tell me about that.
It's hard to how to phrase this so that my older children don't hear it and get mad at me. We know a lot of people with special needs, and we deal with certain issues today that maybe fall on the spectrum now that we didn't necessarily know was even possibly on the spectrum because it's changed. So there's a lot of talk about how many people have autism today compared to how many people had autism. But when you keep changing the definition of what makes someone autistic, your numbers are going to change too.
Sure.
But whether I agree with the numbers or not, there are kids out there who are hurting because they're misunderstood. And I write books to kind of help parents and those around kids to kind of understand that I may be different or I may not be like you, but what you need is patience and you need to let us make our own mistakes. I think those are important things and messages kids need to hear. I've been telling people here at the conference, I write the stories that are the quiet conversations that kids maybe didn't know how to put into words but needed to hear.
That's beautiful. And these books or these stories include dragons. So how does that work?
Some of them do include dragons. That's right. So my youngest daughter was waking me up in the middle of the night, and in true homeschool fashion, I put her brain to work.
There you go. That's exactly what my wife does. Oh, you can't sleep? Oh, you're doing the dishes. Okay, but in your case, oh, you're writing a book.
That's right. Well, I wrote the book. My brain was put to work too. But I was thinking, okay, so what topics do my kids need to ruminate on as they sleep? And I needed a character that was ferocious enough to keep those bad dreams away, so she'd stay in her own bed and let me sleep. And still gentle enough to not be scary. So my main dragon is a bubble-blowing dragon.
Oh, wow. So not fire-breathing, but bubble-blowing.
Bubble-blowing, because how can you be scared of someone who blows dragons or
right.
Bubbles, right?
Yeah, that's not scary at all. It's funny. Yeah.
Exactly. But he's still a dragon.
Yes.
So he still emits some respect
to
other creatures, right? So my first 3 books are all about Bubbles, the bubble-blowing dragon, and my daughter, Princess Charlotte. And then we pulled in a nephew or one of her cousins from out of state to help her feel closer to him. And they tackle difficult subjects like conflict resolution. But I don't tell kids that. That's between me and the parents.
That's a grown-up word.
That's a grown-up word. What I tell kids is it's a fun adventure story with fairies and dragons, and they even have some pie. And don't worry, they let Bubbles have some pie too.
Yeah. So why did you decide to use stories and stories involving bubble-blowing dragons to teach these lessons? Why is that your method of education with kids and parents?
Well, the truth with books is that it's not when you read the book the first time that any kind of message makes any impact on your life. It's as you read the book and you talk about the book and you think about the book and you dream about the book that it starts to impact your psyche. So especially telling a child a story in the middle of the night or at bedtime, their brains have time to work through some of these social issues that they're thrown at in everyday life and that the book throws at them. And their brains have time to make connections that their awake brain doesn't have time for, because we throw so much at our kids. And let's face it, as homeschooling parents, since life is learning, they might hit a few more things in any given day than maybe a kid who's in public school who can compartmentalize. I only have to memorize this until the next test. Well, my kids don't get away with that. They have to master everything.
That's right. You can't skimp on that when you're homeschooling. So it's you're always getting a quiz in a sense.
That's right. And one of the fun things that I would do with my daughter is she'd wake me up, and if I just couldn't that night, I'm like, I want you to tell me what Bubbles the dragon did in your dreams last night. Go back, lay back down, and create your own adventure.
That's great. Well, where can our listeners find you and your books?
So I have a website. It's sillygeesepublishing.com. My books are all also on all the big book sites. I don't know if I can name all of them, but you can find me on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Walmart.com. Target has a couple, they're just kind of all over the place. You just type in my name, Shannon Mockery, and they'll pretty much all come up.
Well, Shannon, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I'm talking now with Joseph Dindinger of Wise Path Books, an online bookstore that's based out of Austin. And Joseph's got a great bookshelf. I wish this was a video podcast. You could see he's got all kinds of books and bookshelves, really beautiful, like premium hardback books, a nice little fireplace and recliner chair here. So, Joseph, you definitely get points for the coziest looking booth here. It's not even a booth. There's no table. But Joseph, tell us about yourself and tell us about your bookstore.
Yeah, thank you, Zach. It's not a booth, and our bookstore is kind of the same thing where it's not a very standard bookstore. It is an eclectic collection of books that we believe are essential for Christians, and in this booth right here, what we've been trying to do is to just make a cozy atmosphere.
Yeah. I love it.
You guys have an amazing booth as well.
Oh, thanks. I'm looking at your nonfiction section. So you've got prominently Live Not by Lies and Fault Lines, books that my wife and I both went through last year, respectively. So some really good, very relevant books for the current time that we're in and sort of this cultural revolution, as I've been calling it. But then you've got a really great assortment of fiction books. So why include novels and particularly fantasy novels, children's, dragon stories? Why put those alongside nonfiction as essential for Christian living?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the answer to that is in an author sort of like C.S. Lewis, right? C.S. Lewis writes a book like Mere Christianity. But he comes to Christ by reading a book called Fantastes by George MacDonald, right? And he says that book baptized his imagination. And God can get to us from all areas. And a lot of the books that we sell are hardcore books for Christians. A non-believer would never pick up a book like, the Benedictine option,
right,
or something like that. But they would pick up a book that is not that is a fantasy book, or even a lot of the books that we sell are by George MacDonald, and they're more Victorian novels, and then there's some fantasies, and they do pick up those books, and then infused in them is the gospel, is the message of truth and beauty, and people get hooked in all kinds of different ways to God, and God can speak to them, and they want more of it, and they'll get a good story, and so we're just hoping that through really good books that people will either be solidified, and our bookstore is more geared, I think, towards Christians. But non-believers as well will find a lot of things. We have classics there, Greek and Roman classics and things of that nature. And so I think that God can speak to us in almost anywhere. And if it's good art, I think it was Madeline, how do you say
Madeline L'Engle?
Yes, Madeline L'Engle, who said that what defines Christian art is if it's good. You know?
Yeah.
And if it's bad art, it's not Christian art. You know? And so
that's a great way of thinking of that. Because what did God say when He created the world? It is good. It is very good. Yes. Yeah. So our own creations should reflect that goodness and that beauty, and not just the truth, but we need all of the above. So as you've been meeting with parents and homeschool families, homeschool kids, tell us about some of those conversations around these books.
So, we're in here, and I think we have books that are a little bit older for parents. This is a homeschool conference, and a lot of parents are just starting out with little kids. But for the parents that have teenagers and are getting into that, they have a lot of things in the world, right? They have, of course, the media, But the books that are pushed in the world, many of them have a very humanistic, sometimes even nihilistic message. And so Christians want a good message. And so a lot of times they're coming, they have that innate desire of the good message, but they know that they need to sell these books to their kids. And it's an amazing, it's not, you can't force your kid to like something. You can't force your kid to read a book. You might be able to force them to sit and watch a movie, but you can't force them to get through a book, right? And so that's what they want. They say, we have some comics, we have some things of that nature, and they're saying, I want something that my kid will like. They like fantasy, they like mysteries, they like whatever they like, and so we're sort of directing them. A lot of times we're directing them to the classics. And we sold a lot of Narnia, we sold Winged Feather Saga. We haven't sold any Tolkien for some reason today, but I think that's because everybody probably has it already.
Yeah. Tell us about, you mentioned George MacDonald, some of his books. You mentioned Fantasy. So I have not read George MacDonald yet. What can you tell me about his books and kind of why those left such a strong impression on C.S. Lewis?
Yeah. So Lewis calls him his master. He says he's never written anything that he didn't quote MacDonald. And if you read his allegory of heaven and hell, MacDonald is actually a character in that book. I don't know if you've read that. It's called The Great Divorce. It's a fantastic book. Yeah. And what MacDonald does is he's a masterful storyteller. Now, that's different than a masterful writer. Some people would say he's not a very good writer because he's very verbose, right? And back then, they used to be paid by the word, so I don't.
That's the style.
Yeah. But he was writing in Victorian England and Scotland at the time, and so he writes stories that are today considered historical fiction, for the most part, and they're my favorite books. My favorite book is called Sir Gibby, and it's difficult to categorize because it is a real setting, but the things that happen, it's like there's been Auden, I think W.H. Auden called MacDonald the last great myth maker. It's because he can infuse fantasy into a realistic setting. It's
so kind of like magic realism.
Yes. And so you're left with a sense of, you can look around and you see sort of like the real world in a different light after you've read MacDonald. I can sit down with a MacDonald novel and it calms my spirit, and I'm left with a desire to be closer to God, to be a better man. And something about that is just transcended in his books that is not, I haven't found in many other places. And I think Lewis really was onto some of that. And anyway.
Well, that whole sense of transcendence, what that's, Lewis and Tolkien had a discussion about fiction as escape, because a lot of people say, a fantasy book or whatever, it's just escapism. And this conversation between Lewis and Tolkien was so illuminating because Tolkien says to him, well, who do you think would be against the idea of escape? A jailer. And if you look at it that way, it's the duty of a prisoner to escape.
Yeah.
And there's so many things in this world that are holding us hostage, whether you want to talk about, big media, big tech, big government, whatever. There are so many forces that are just holding us hostage in our minds and our attention. And what you just described of this book drawing you closer to God, calming you down. I mean, how much does everything now is like running on dopamine, and that just keeps you awake and keeps you anxious. But a story like the one you described is it kind of it brings you to that calmer place, that closeness with God. That he's not giving us a spirit of fear, right? But a spirit of power, love, and self-discipline. And so, a story from a Christian author should kind of help you feel that way. So that's that's exactly the kind of story that those are exactly the kind of books that we love to talk about on this podcast. And so it's really cool that you're bringing these classics, back from the past because. Hey, we don't always need something new. Sometimes we just need a new understanding of something old. And we need to bring something back that may have been forgotten. So I love that you're doing that. The covers on those books look incredible. So again, it just looks like your bookstore looks very, very cozy.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, to your point, Lewis, I forget, it's in an introduction to a classic book. He says every time you read a new book, you should go back afterwards and read an old book. So you should switch off like that, because he says everybody writing today is kind of writing in the same vein, in the same mindset. And you got to go back to old classics and read them in order to kind of break free of that. I'm a firm believer in that.
That's awesome. So Joseph, where can our listeners find your bookstore?
It's just wisepathbooks.com.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and
thank you.
Everybody go check out wisepathbooks.com. Thanks, Joseph.
Thank you, Zach. Appreciate it.
All right, we're talking to Matt Ludak from Lamplighter Ministries. And tell us about Lamplighter and this bookstore you're running over here. It looks awesome. Once again, it's a set of old-fashioned books that are kind of being revitalized with beautiful premium hardback covers. Like our last guest has some of those. So tell us about the books that you sell, Matt.
Well, Lamplighter Ministries was started about 25 years ago, and they really had a heart for republishing these books from the golden age of Christian literature, even though it wasn't really called Christian literature at that time, from the 1800s mostly, some a little bit earlier, some a little bit later. But these are great stories that were written from a biblical worldview, and just full of rich language, great character development, and really demonstrating both good and bad character qualities. But the stories just have an extra level of depth, and they really can reveal character and our relationship with the Lord and issues of faith. And so we've read them aloud as a family for about 20 years now, and our kids also read them, and they're just really at the heart of our home education and what we do. It's just been a very sweet thing, to draw us together as a family and also to increase our faith.
What's the most recent book that you guys have read together as a family?
There's one called The Spiral Staircase, and it is an incredible story about a man who takes a train and shows up at this town by the coast, and there is a castle and there's a lot of history to this town that people go there for getaways. And it looks like he's kind of getting away from something and having a fresh start, but you don't really know what that is. But then as the story develops, he's staying at this castle, which is sort of partly in ruins, and he ends up encountering all these people that he's grown up with or known, because they're going there for a time of getaway. And then there's all these interactions and things that happen trying to reveal what has happened to him and why he's there. And it also has to do with the history of the castle and what's going on there, and then all the relationships. And it's an incredible story. It has an element of mystery to it, but at the heart of it, it's a man discovering where he can recover from a hard situation, and he ends up really getting drawn deeper into his faith, having a fresh start, and it's really a powerful story.
That sounds great. I was talking to your son when I visited your booth, and I said, what kind of stories do you have here that are, kind of fantastical in nature? And he mentioned two. One is the Unseen Hand, and the other one was called the Haunted Room. Mm-hmm. So tell me what those stories were about. Those sounded really cool.
Well, The Hidden Hand is...
Hidden Hand.
Yeah. The Hidden Hand is pretty much our all-time favorite family read. I mean, it's an incredible story that's set in the Virginia area a long time ago, but multiple different characters. Basically, there's a young girl who is a street urchin that's kind of there's a whole story about how she got to be on her own like that and what her parentage is, and that's how the story just jumps right into it. And then all these other characters, both good and bad, and how they're all related to her and her inheritance. I mean, it is a wild ride of all these unexpected. And when we were reading this as a family, we would literally have to stay up until about midnight, because you would end each chapter, and then no, we can't end there. So I mean, our whole family loves it, and at the heart of it is you see the hidden hand of God in each one of these characters' lives, both the ones that are evil and also the ones you see them fighting against these characters, and you see their character being tested through hard circumstances, and it's amazing those that persevere, and you really admire their character, and you learn from. And there's one character in particular called Capitola, who is like this fiery young girl, the one that was started out as a street urchin and then ends up becoming part of this family when she discovers her family that is very well off and having privileges, but she never loses this sort of like kind of hardiness, like be able to provide for herself, but she kind of rides that line, of not, but she's able to be within the context of a family and not just be hardened by her experiences. And it's really sweet to see the transformation that happens to her.
Yeah, that sounds like a great book for a family. Tell me about is it The Hidden Room was the other one?
The Haunted Room.
The Haunted Room.
The Haunted Room kind of has a similar feel to the other book. It's a family that inherits a house that has this reputation for being haunted. So they kind of don't buy into all that. But then they discover that, as they get there, and they kind of discover why this legend happened, and there's also, there's some reasons why that this legend is there, and it turns out, of course, that it's not truly haunted, but they were trying to portray that there were some backdoor dealings and things that had happened that needed to get exposed, and they were able to do that, and this family is able to come together around that and receive this inheritance, and then also kind of restore that house to its rightful owner. So it's interesting.
Yeah, your son told me what he really liked about that book is it pointed him towards the haunted or the hidden rooms of his soul, the places that he tries to keep a God out of, and so it really shows him how you got to give your whole self to God. And so I thought that was a really neat takeaway from that. So
yeah,
it sounds like there's a lot of really good lessons in these books, and which sort of answers my next question. But you guys read these books as a family. There's only so much time, and there's only so many things we can do as a family. So why read these classic books? Why read fiction, and why read these fiction books?
Well, the reason that we just sort of started it on a lark. Someone had recommended we try it about 20 years ago. We started with these Lamplighter books. And it ended up being so engaging for our family. We didn't want to do other forms of entertainment, and it was something that ended up just really bringing our family together. And then it also created kind of a form of interaction with our family where we could refer to the characters in these different books, and we know what we're talking about when we're dealing with various things in our own family, relationships or faith issues, and it gives us kind of a foundation for something to refer to. All these amazing stories now that we have 200 plus books that we've read together out loud like that, and it kind of gives us a common language, a reference point. So yeah, it's really
almost like a shorthand. So that I'm a Star Trek guy and a Star Wars guy. One of my favorite Star Trek episodes is Darmok, where they meet this species that only talks in stories. And it's how they communicate everything that they want to say is by just referring to these kind of moments from stories. But I love that is a shared language that y'all have as a family. And it's like you said, so many families just don't want to be a part of the modern media establishment. Disney has been in the news a lot lately in a bad sort of way. And hey, we don't always need the latest show, the latest story. Sometimes there are classic stories that generations of Christians have enjoyed. And so it's great to rediscover those and read those together. And it sounds like that can be just as entertaining as binging the next Netflix show, that it can keep you up late at night, just like, whatever the latest thing is on streaming.
Yeah.
So it sounds like a really fun way for families to enjoy those stories together.
Yeah,
so.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Matt. And where can our listeners find the Lamplighter Bookstore?
Well, you just go to lamplighter.net, and they've got a great website there, and they have both all the books. They also have dramatic audio books, which are really powerful as well,
awesome.
That you can get either downloadable or CDs of those. And those are basically the same people that do Focus on the Family. That do a lot of theirs are the same actors in these. And so
that's great. We're big fans of them.
Yeah,
so.
yeah, they're really well done.
All right, well, that's lamplighter.net. Thank you so much, Matt, for joining us.
Sure, glad to be here.
Our last guest today is Chris Elston from Shine a Light Press, and he's an author of fantasy. Chris, tell us about what you write.
Well, I've got 2 different book series. One is The Four Corners, and it's going to be a trilogy. I've got The Four Corners and Four Corners of Darkness out now, and Four Corners of Winter will come up next. And it's basically kind of like in the Narnia books where a family is transported to another world. In this case, it's a world called Kadash, which is a Hebrew word that means set apart. Of course, in the Bible, it means, the Jewish people were set apart. But in this case, the families that get brought to this world end up on 4 separate islands. And when they are transported, they're kind of falling apart. The parents are on the brink of divorce. And in this scenario, they kind of realize how much they love each other and want to be together. And so it's the adventure comes with them trying to get to the other islands and find each other, and they fight through all kinds of crazy weather, and they fight wild animals and also monsters. So, yeah.
Well, I like that. It's a family that's fighting through danger fighting to get back together.
That's right, exactly.
So I imagine that resonates very powerfully with homeschool families and people that care about strong families.
Yeah, I hope so. That's kind of the core message of it, is that family is super important, and we need to fight to follow God's rules on how to keep it together, and relationships are important. We have a relational God, so.
Well, something I noticed at your booth I really liked is that you have a study guide that goes along with these books.
That's right.
So tell us about that, and how does that work with the stories?
Okay. Yeah. Well, my wife has over 20 years in the classroom as a private school teacher. She wrote a novel study to go along with the first book, and she's going to write one for the second book as well. And we also wrote together a group study that's meant for families to study together. And so that's kind of what Shine a Light does. We try to focus on the educational aspects of the books and bring that out. And in some cases, we even pull out different elements other than just the literary stuff. In a lot of cases, we pull out history lessons and science and all kinds of stuff. So
let me ask you this. Why not just do the study guides? Like, why did you decide to also write these novels?
The books novels are something I've just always wanted to do. I actually spent about 15 years in LA trying to be a screenwriter, and got some work and got to do what I loved and actually get paid for it. But books were always on my heart, and eventually I wanted to get back to family, and I'd started dating my now wife and wanted to get back up to Washington State at the time to actually date her for real, because we'd been dating long distance. And so I decided to leave Hollywood and focus on the books, and that's kind of where it came from. So, yeah.
And what do you like about stories in terms of conveying these lessons and these messages about families? Like, what do you think is uniquely powerful about stories?
Well, I think if you can write relatable characters, then you can really get people thinking. If they can relate to the characters. I always say the most interesting stories take ordinary people and put them in extraordinary circumstances. And there's just a lot of lessons that you can teach through that, because people are connecting to the characters, and so they can kind of wonder, how would they react in that scenario and things like that. So
that's great. Any other books that you're working on or you want to talk about?
Real quick, I also have another series called The Gift of the Elements, and that's about young people that start developing the ability to control an element. So there's right now I have the gift of Tyler, which is earth, the gift of Rio, which is water, and I have outlined but haven't written yet wind and fire. So,
and what are the themes and the messages that you're conveying through those stories?
Those are primarily about finding God's purpose. I think that we all have some kind of gift in us that comes from the Lord, and so the point is to figure out what that is and then use it the way He intends you to use it.
That sounds awesome. So, Chris, where can our listeners find you and your books?
ShineAlightPress.com, and pretty much wherever books are sold. ShineAlightPress.com is the most direct route, though. But Perfect. Yeah, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever.
Well, that's great. Well, Chris, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Well, Well, to you, our listener, especially if you're joining us for the first time on Fantastical Truth, if you came to us from the homeschool convention or just the kind of the wider homeschool community, we hope you've enjoyed all these interviews with authors, publishers, and book distributors. I think as you've seen from these interviews, there's a wide variety of options to find the books for yourself and for your children of all different ages and genre interests. I particularly like the interviews where we talked about books that the whole family can read together, or books that are for very young children and have the Christian worldview either there overtly or there kind of in the background. I think these are all very family-friendly books that a lot of homeschool families can get on board with. And a lot of these stories are just going very imaginative ways, like finding a drawing of a grenade in Charles Dickens' journal. I think that was my favorite kind of mental picture from author Aaron Gruben. That was a really fun story. And but I just I loved actually seeing these books, Stephen, these premium hardcover books that were from the 17 or 1800s, and now they've been reprinted. And as I mentioned earlier in the podcast, that I think we're hitting the second golden age of Christian fiction, Christian fantasy. We've already had kind of that first golden age, as we heard from Matt Ludek from Lamplighter. Let's hope that we're in a new golden era of fiction.
Right on the cusp of that. I would love to see that happen in my lifetime. Maybe this terraforming project won't take as long as I originally surmised, but hey, if it takes a few generations to make sure that God glorifying fantastical stories are the default genre that Christians enjoy, along with, of course, the Bible first of all and nonfiction after that, then I'd be perfectly happy to see that. Just seeing all of this stuff, all of these wonderful creators at these conferences makes me feel at once at home and also a little envious, because at home I can remember kind of the cusp of this little homeschool revolution already making me into the person that I am today. But now I feel a little envious seeing all of these resources just imagining, wow, if all of this had been available when I was a kid, then how much nerdier would I be even now? Who knows? We may be able to advance that terraforming project even faster, but it is God's timing for when he wants his people to get hold of this older wisdom, these older resources, and of course, more biblical motivation for Christian fantasy. That's up to his providence. We can only be side characters in his story with Jesus as the hero. Thanks for listening to Lorehaven. As Zach said, if you've not subscribed to the podcast, please do so. Leave us a rating, of course, if you like. Go back to our episodes. Check out especially the ones we did just a couple months ago, talking to S.D. Smith and Phil Lawler and Megan Basham and others. And, of course, subscribe to Lorehaven. That's the way you enter the Lorehaven Guild exclusive community. Just go to lorehaven.com and find the pop-up, enter your name. We do new book reviews of Christian-made fantasy, the best we can find, every Friday, as well as new podcast episodes every Tuesday and articles throughout the week. Well, I mentioned that we are taking some time to ourselves after the conference, which means that we have not had time to go over all those blinking lights from backed up holographic messages from Fantastical Truth listeners over at the comm station. So we're going to wait on that for this episode. I can say, however, that next on Fantastical Truth, we are planning more episodes for the spring season of 2022, including a look at the resurrection through the eyes of an apologist who loves Christian imagination. We're also going to be talking to at least one more homeschooler, as I'm planning at least two more homeschool conferences. Well, at least one more homeschool conference. Hopefully I'll get to two in addition to the Realm Makers Conference this summer. We'll be talking with one graduated homeschool student who loves reading these kinds of stories and can speak more from the inside about why Christian homeschool families love these so much. We're also hoping to explore a little bit more of that topic we accidentally set up earlier, talking about Disney and these efforts to make Christian or culturally conservative alternatives to the mouse that increasingly has become the mouse Borg, trying to assimilate Christian worldview in service to this more sexual worshiping worldview. That's been done before, these Christian alternatives, but now more people are talking about them, and we are reaching out to the creators behind at least one of these big efforts just recently announced, and hope to have an update for you shortly here on Fantastical Truth. Meanwhile, whether you're a homeschooler or a Christian schooler or a public schooler still hanging in there, please know that we are praying for you. We are supporting you, Christian parents, in whatever you feel called to do to educate your children. We just hope that you will educate them, as the conference title says, that you'll be teaching them diligently. You'll be not just introducing them to moral virtue, but introducing them to Jesus, the hero of this true fantastical story, and it's him we serve as we continue to seek and find his fantastical truth.